She's been allocated. Morning, everyone. Sorry, a little bit of a slow start. Some inevitable tech problems. But welcome and thanks for coming. Yeah, I think we're ready to go. I think I'm going to introduce our dean, Tony Edwards, who's going to give you a welcome.
Thank you, Sharon. Thanks very much. And I do understand the merits of brevity. I've been to lots of conferences myself where someone who thinks they're important stands up and speaks for far too long, so I promise not to speak for too long. So, as Sharon says, I'm the Dean of FLUX London, and it's my privilege to have that role and to welcome you all to this conference. FLUX London is an interdisciplinary school made up of institutes in 5 different subject areas. 2 institutes in management, 2 in different areas of social sciences, digital technologies. Being Loughborough, we have one in sport, and of course one in design too, a design institute here, which is flourishing. A number of the members of it are here today. It's flourishing in terms of recruitment of students, in terms of our partnerships with external organisations, and in terms of our growing links in the design community with the Design and Creative Arts School in the East Midlands. So it's very much an integrated operation across the 2 campuses. So I'm delighted to see the event today. Hope you enjoy it. Please stick around for the first bit and check my diaries. I've got to go before too long. Welcome again, Sharon.
Good morning, everyone. I will also try to be brief. There's a few things that I just want to touch on before we hand over to our first stewards of the day. So I am Sharon Prentival. I'm a senior lecturer within the Institute of Design Innovation, and I've been head of our research group for about 4 years, leading kind of the articulation of what we do within the Design Institute, which to some extent has led to this event today, but also other activities that have been happening over the last while. So I think the FLUX Symposium is a little bit of a stake in the ground about what we're about, and a proposition about how our nascent research community here within Loughborough, London, within IDI, is kind of developing its research agenda. So we are obviously today and yesterday have been talking about this concept of flux as an expression about our changing socio-political context, our ecological challenges, and how we as a design community can kind of build a response to that. We've made a proposition of kind of 3 thematic areas through which we can talk about this conceptualization, which also picks up on emerging theories within design research, particularly around ontological design and those kind of domains. But within IDI, as I say, we're also kind of making a proposition of an IDI flux research agenda, which is concerned about our shared futures, informed by the realities of what design has already done in the world, insofar as we live in a made world, and therefore our future is always bound up with our past. In terms of the cultures within and through which we design, but also this articulation of a theory practice of design. We've already recorded 2 episodes of a podcast. If you haven't had a listen, it's really good, great, a very inspirational, people to listen to who you have the privilege of listening to again today. So I encourage you to have to tune in. After FLUX today and tomorrow, today is done. We will have a reflection on the event with Professor Ginny Dragon in a few weeks, so there is more forthcoming there. Yesterday we had a super day with our doctoral students. They were very, excited and a little bit fearful, I think, of speaking to Julie and Ezio about their work, and I know from listening to them that they found it invaluable to have that, brief time where they were asking critical questions about what they're doing. And they all put a lot of effort into it, from posters to, more performative pieces, and prototypes as well. So there's some posters down in the foyer. Do have a look when you have time. We did allocate an early career scholarship to a BAME BIPOC scholar, and it was awarded to Maria Carozzosa. And very frustratingly, even though we paid for a fast-track visa, her visa did not come through on time, so she's not here with us today. But we will try to make it up to her by bringing her for a study trip at another time. So she did submit her poster, and we chose this poster because it focuses in on the listening dimension of dialogue, which Leslie Ann emphasized in the podcast as really the kind of core element of what we need to be doing. And there she is yesterday having her tutorial with Ezio. We of course had our first talk last night with Ezio, which was around care and proximity and some kind of critical conversations about that. And we have the agenda forthcoming. I just want to reflect a little bit on some of the kind of important criticisms made already by some of the stewards, the academic stewards that are with us. I don't want to go over too much. Just in response to the kind of symposium theme, some of the things that have already been said by Ramia, Gilly, Erling, is to problematize this kind of idea of crisis as disavowing kind of some of the more structural issues that perpetuate injustices in the world. So this idea of crisis being a kind of a cloak that is misleading. Dialogue also, Norcia in particular had some kind of critiques of as kind of glossing over a little bit the issues of incommensurability as a technical kind of concept, that we come from different framings or worldviews, and this kind of conception of dialogue is perhaps overly consensual and therefore, again, cloaks or disavows the realities of more conflictual situations. So in the podcast, we've also moved from concepts of difference maybe towards conviviality as a common way of living, and also towards away from dialogue, maybe more towards embodied ideas of change, deliberation, the importance of our histories in how we articulate design futures. So I think my point is that there's a theme written up in the symposium booklet, but there's already been quite a lot of deconstruction of that in the conversations already. And that is it in terms of that. So today we have two sessions this morning. We have Professor Ramia Mazet and Professor Erling Björkhusen, who will speak to their topics for a little bit, and then we can have an open conversation. So that will be setting the scene. And then after lunch, Professor Leslie Ann Noel will do a workshop with us. I have a version of her critical alphabet toolkit here if you want to have a quick look at it. I think we'll be using it in the afternoon. And I think that's quite apposite because Norcia, who's a social scientist here, will run the session after Leslie Ann. And one of Norcia's kind of interests is how social scientists can work with designers and the role of designers in bringing new forms of dialogue. That kind of is what we'll be doing then. And finally, we have Professor Julie Chagan, who at the end of the day is going to do quite a place-based, my words, session that is a bit performative actually, and quite working with some participants, giving a kind of a narrative history really of the Here East development. So there you go. That is it from me, and I welcome Ramia and my colleague Dr. Pandora Shipwright, who's going to co-chair the session with us.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Sharon. I'm Pandora Shipwright. I'm a Lever Theme Early Career Fellow here at the Institute for Design Innovation at Loughborough, London. So I'm going to introduce this morning's two speakers, and just to reiterate what Sharon said, they will each be giving a full talk And then we will go into what will hopefully be a very lively conversation with some discussion between them. But I really want to encourage everyone to jump in with their questions, comments, and we really hope that the session and the rest of today's proceedings will be a good opportunity for dialogue.
Just two things. We're recording the session, so everyone's aware. If you don't want your image on any communications, just let us know. There's also little red, yellow cards on the desks and some markers at the back if you want to offer up some of your reflections on what's discussed this morning. There shouldn't be a fire alarm, but if there is, the fire exit is right at the back of the room.
Can you just talk about toilets?
The toilets are just out the door on the left. Thank you.
Okay, so without further ado, I will introduce Ramia who started in autumn 2020 as Professor in Design for Social Innovation and Sustainability at London College of Communication, University of the Arts, UK. Ramia has been an editor at the leading scholarly journal Design Issues since 2016. Previously in Finland, she was a professor and head of education in the Department of Design at Aalto University, and prior to that, she worked at CONCEPTUALIZING, College of Arts, Crafts and Design, KTH, Royal Institute of Technology, the National Doctoral School Design Fakulteten, and the Interactive Institute in Sweden. A designer and architect by training, her PhD is in interactive design. She's led, published, and exhibited widely through major interdisciplinary and international practice-based design research projects, most recently in social and sustainable design, design activism, and design for policy. She specializes in participatory, critical, and politically engaged design practices, as well as research through design and feminist epistemologies. So Professor Maze's talk is entitled FLUX and Future, Conceptualizing Change in, by, Beyond Design. And Ramia, you're very welcome. Do you know how to switch this?
Super, thank you, Pandora. Also, especially thank you, Case and Sharon for inviting me to this discussion, and also to my co-dialogue people from the symposium in spring, which was really the background to many of, I think, the threads that we'll go through today. So my title, Flux and Future, is a way of sort of creating a space between those words and sort of starting to talk about and challenge and perhaps interrogate more critically as well as creatively notions of change, processes, practices of change in a way. And there's no doubt that change is needed. We've been talking about it for quite a long time. And the future is often one of those rhetorical devices, if not a very specific idea. It's often an evocation, an exclamation that somehow change is needed. But the future or future can mean many different things. One of the things you can hear in the podcast is some of the discussions around what kind of future, which conceptions of future. For example, what can be in common? What can be a common future? Is it? Can it be? What does it mean to evoke that, even if it's difficult or not even possible to achieve, for example, in relation to issues of commensurability and differences and injustices and many of the both practical but also epistemological and ontological differences within our world today, and maybe even worlds today. Again, future evocations of, oh gosh, how does this look like this? I can see if I can make this look better. There we go. This is another evocation of the future, slogan of Greta Thunberg's movement, Fridays for Future, which in fact is a kind of existential challenge of the future, the younger generation who may or may not live or come to survive in the future. Many parts of the world are already, if not collapsed, collapsing. We've heard already many of these challenges from the Pacific Island nations to COP. And the aftermath of COP hosted here in the UK a couple of years ago. So who can talk about the future? In what way is there even a future? And a younger generation and other parts of the world, many peoples saying it's a luxury, it's a privilege to dream or even to talk about the future. Let's stay with the trouble. If I borrow some words from Donna Haraway, and challenge and look at the now and also the crisis or the changes that need to happen now, rather than only talking about somewhere else, some when else, which belongs to certain winners in our society. So futurity and this rhetoric of future is at stake in many design arguments and practices. Assumptions of the direction of time, progression, progress seem to underlie popular design rhetorics concerning the new, transformation, innovation, invention, and often these kind of assumptions underlying have an idea of what a preferred future may be. And those preferred futures are often implicit or tacit in design, even as, following the words of, for example, Herbert Simon, we have an idea that design is specifically about changing from the now to a preferred future, but whose future, which future, what progress, whose development, and so on are often things that we don't challenge, interrogate within design. We rather take the rhetorics, borrow the methods, and without engaging more critically in different conceptions of temporality and futurity, or even differences, even if we choose to adopt the rhetoric or even methods, for example, future studies, as I do. So rhetoric of the future and even future images proliferate in our university promotional materials. I saw plenty on buildings and signs on the way here, and I see plenty in my own university futures colleagues working with that as well. And the number of proliferating education programs with the word futures in it, I think, is quite astonishing in the last years. And for me, one of the purposes of design education, but even more generally education and the role of theory, conferences like this, is, if I am inspired by bell hooks, is to challenge, to shake us up, to provoke, to shift our paradigms, to change the way we think, to turn us around. And that's sort of my point of departure from today. For me, the future is not elsewhere, somewhen. It's the demand, even now, in whatever concepts we have, to turn us around, to shake us up. But maybe rather than reactive modes of crisis, to go deeper, to critically interrogate, and to dialogue and develop deeper relations to other disciplines, practices, peoples, and places from which we need to learn and engage. So raising the question of flux, of futures, notions of change or difference, for me is also a call to criticality. And through my years as first a designer and as a researcher, I've come to appreciate the role and power of critical theory and practice. And for me, one role of critical theory is to, among other things, examine everyday life, to ask how particular norms, hegemonies, assumptions, in and exclusions, how these are constructed and reproduced in many ways through many practices and through design. For example, other practices such as critical historiography ask questions about the past. Critical future studies interrogate the future as a concept, but also futures as they are produced, reproduced in various practices and in various public audiences as well. And for me, a specific set of critical theories, for example, feminist critical modalities, do explicitly explore how things could be otherwise, not only critiquing, interrogating, but how things could be otherwise, or other how, if I borrow a term from Donna Petrescu, one of our colleagues here in the UK from Sheffield. taken into practice, critical theory is not neutral in questioning, in naming, in framing. We have, and in fact we may want to destabilize how things were before, how things are now, and open new possibilities for thought and action. Again, turn us around. And to pick a sort of just example to bring one approach to this to life, it's an example of an image of the future. This is Stockholm's Vision 2030, a guide to the future. I've spent the last 2 days at a symposium around place, knowledge, and the future with geographers, political economists, and future studies people in Germany. And the future, and this kind of future practice, these visions of the futures, future scenarios, are what they do and what they do at very high and macro scales of government policy and even research. So this is a genre of practice, envisioning the future. And so I have an example of that through which I want to kind of interrogate how we can critically, how we can turn us around as we engage with such powerful practices, for example, of future studies within or through design. And I've got a project here reflecting explicitly on this Stockholm Vision 2030 as an example. So this is a document produced by Stockholm. It's very much targeted towards a specific idea of progress, of development. It's addressing investors, it's addressing companies, it's addressing tourists, it's addressing very specific audiences and attracting them to Stockholm as a place of innovation, a very specific kind of innovation and growth, a very specific set of people, a very specific set of places are even identified. Hammarby-Sjöstad, for example, is on this map. In contrast, in protest to this, my colleagues that come from future studies, but feminist future studies, that come from architecture, that come from various more critical, theoretical and practical approaches within design and art, produced an alternative Stockholm 2030. Ulrika Gunnarsson-Östling, who's one of the people in this project, has in her research and practice of future studies outside this project critiqued the way that mainstream futures has very specific assumptions, very specific ideas about what the future is, about how to get there, about what the preferred future might be. So for her and for Josephine Wengel, my collaborator of many years, they comment that futures visions like Stockholm 2030 and many, many, many that we see around us all the time, including in our own institutional brochures, are largely devoid or uncritical of some of the assumptions, some of the audiences, some of the preferences about that future. Future studies have tended to imagine the future as a technological and material thing somehow, in which the future is a discrete and definite location, a place that might be arrived at or colonized, as some scholars have discussed, through linear transition pathways, along which the development of particular technologies are the privileged baseline for plotting human, cultural, and societal progress, if the social, much less the ecological, are even considered at all. So this particular direction of time, the linearity of time, and the way in which time, the baseline by which progress is measured, is something that feminist future studies scholars such as Ulrika Gunnarsson-Östling study. And in this particular project, they've looked very deeply into feminist political ecology and feminist post-capitalist economics. For example, collaborating with the scholars J. Jacobson Graham to really look at what are the underpinnings, not just the imagery, not just the brochure places, what are the underpinning economic, political, cultural, social ideas and structures which can be interrogating in constructing or reconstructing, critiquing, and maybe dismantling and proposing a different vision of Stockholm's future. And so they produced a series of images along with a series of texts, also in the way that design and architecture have a particular capacity, which is increasingly appreciated in policy studies, not to produce heavy reports, but to produce pretty communicative, persuasive images. They've used that creativity, that materiality, but in a very different way. This is not a glossy image. This is not the image as in a touristic Stockholm 2030 full of kind of Benetton colors with less colorful people. This is a very different aesthetic. This is a people, animals, places are very differently represented here, but also the ideas, the structures underneath and behind these images are very different. For example, the notion of a diverse economy, which comes from this alternative economies of Gibson Graham, for example. You have different notions of reuse of space, of repurposing of space, of mixed use and mixed functions, including of the foregrounding of children and children's voices, for example, often left out of political processes. Even in this, do animals become part and have a voice in policy and in democratic discourse? This is all obviously connecting also to the voices of ecology and how that is represented, not only in planning, but also in, not only in spatial planning, but also in social planning and policy, for example. So there's a lot of complex ideas embedded behind this that produce these images in various ways. They have also developed a series of proposals for specific places in Stockholm, very specifically different places involving different people and highlighting, spotting already existing practices and organizations unrecognized within the official or the Stockholm touristy kind of vision. And for them, this is only a starting point. For many, we in design might think this is the end. We produce a vision of the future. And then we go about designing or producing or, plotting that future. But for them, this is a starting point for dialogue and debate. This is, and when we taught together KTH in Stockholm, this is what you get to halfway through the course. And then from there you depart to further deliberations, debates, different kind of critical and creative activities that are participatory in nature before. So this is not an end product, but an articulation of a different point of view, a different set of priorities, and a very distinct difference from Stockholm 2030. So for me, this is also an evocation of what images of the future and future practices can be about. Very often in future studies context, the question comes about, well, how do we get to that future? How do we know what the future holds? And there's a kind of epistemological uncertainty and insecurity in future studies because data about the future is hard to come by. It's very hard somehow to get all the evidence together to persuade for one future or the other. And in the words of Jerome Glenn, I'm interested not in what do we know about the future, what data do we need to persuade about the future, what empirical evidence do we need to amass in order to get to a particular future. I'm interested in what difference a future's practice can do. So not reaching that future, not knowing about the future, what difference in the today, in the here and now, can these kind of images have? And so this is a purpose for me in future studies. Again, there's lots of different ways in which those futures images do have impact, can make a difference in the here and now. For example, in future studies, we speak about how such images can expand mental horizons, enhance anticipatory consciousness, to stimulate change in the present, and more closely to design, I'm interested in how some of the kind of interdisciplines that are emerging in design allow us to investigate beyond these images what consequences, and I'm interested specifically in the social political implications of these futures. So we have practices such as design anthropology, in which we can use such images to probe into different ideas, communities, processes at various levels involving communities. Such images or prototypes of the future can be placed into niches, for example, in living labs, as many colleagues do, which are about testing or precautionary testing of future ideas, future technologies, future ways of living before they are made into policy or produced outside the living lab. So we can also talk about rehearsing the future, as a colleague Joachim Hause talks about in his doctorate. We can talk about prefigurative practices, which is trying out, testing out, or even identifying undesigned, vernacular, maybe more everybody designs kind of practices, which may be very different, extreme, and so on and so on. Transition towns is a popular example, but there are many, many more. For example, degrowth communities, and my colleague Eva Houtbeckers, who works and live and researches from within that, and feminist embodied utopias. Very different communities, individual and collective practices that do live and try to prototype the future in a very different way. So beyond the future, and again, I've critiqued the notion and many practices of the future. It's only one modality of thinking about change, and I think it has a very specific, useful way of thinking about change, which is in what direction, what difference does this future do for us now, but what is the difference between this future and another future, for example? So the difference that such images made, and the politics, the different politics, and the different people in those futures is of interest to me. But beyond future and design futures, there's other kinds of design practices, concepts, and ways of relating to change. In my dissertation, I explored many of those, in addition to futurity, around, for example, notions of becoming, emergence, and so on. So emergence and becoming, for example, might be a way to appreciate the things that are already happening, the prefigurative practices, the seeds of change. In some ways, I just want to point out there are lots and lots of very different ways of doing design today, emerging from many parts of the world. You can see this map is turned upside down. This is a directory of design practices, individuals and collectives around the world who are trying to interrogate and do design very, very differently. This is a document produced by Nina Pime and Julia Sommerfeld as part of Claudio Moraes' conference Beyond Change some years ago. And in addition to the conference, they set up a space of equal size and invited a precarity pilot, Decolonizing Design, many of these platforms, to demonstrate and engage people outside the academic discourse into their practices from other places, you can say. And maybe parts of the world, or at least places in design. And speaking on this notion of prefigurative practices and where change come from, it really does not always, or even rarely, come from design. And I think this is an example that tries to ask that question and turn us around, or turn the world on its head. And another way that we can look at change practices, or even the role of design in change practices, is examining different prefigurative practices, and potentially in different parts of the world, or in very different worlds than maybe we are predominantly surrounded by, for example, here, and I even think here, possibly in relation to Julie's intervention later. And I just wanted to point to one of the ways that one of the projects through which I tried to get some ideas about that. This is a paper I've recently written, which is based on a kind of an analysis of the Cape Town as the World Design Capital in 2014. It was the first World Design Capital in the Global South. One of the first was in Torino, Ezio's conference with colleagues, Changing the Change some years ago, which had a very specific idea, the World Design Capital in Torino had a very specific idea about what design was, what it could do, what future would be produced by design. I do remember a car, and very, obviously the industries of that region were involved along with food and so on. But my question was, what does design mean here, and what does design mean in this very specific moment, 2014, which happened to be the 20-year anniversary of the post-apartheid moment. So a very politically loaded time in which to sort of situate a world design capital and negotiate what is the world, what is the design in the context of that specific political moment. And I looked at various of the examples that push themselves into the World Design Capital, various ways in which the World Design Capital organizers try to define and promote and develop design, and also different ways in which they try to reframe and perhaps co-opt some practices as design, which I think is also very, very interesting. The boundaries of design in a continent where the word design does not exist in any local language. So what is design? This is a chance to rethink that. At least that's one of the things I was interested in. How am I doing on time? Okay. Yeah. So this is coming out of the airport. Again, the World Design Capital grabs you with its yellow color, and its ubiquitous logo, which does not change whether it's Torino or Helsinki, which it was a couple of years before, to here. So there is a worldness and the world city syndrome of the World Design Capital, and also of Cape Town itself is very interesting as a phenomenon, despite the fact that one of the themes was African innovation alongside beautiful objects in the typology of design framed through the World Design Capital organization in Cape Town. And one example of the projects that were kind of captured or included very early on, even one of the first 3 projects that were pitched to the World Design Organization to become the World Design Capital, is not a design project at all, in depending on how you look and how you define, but the VPUU project, which you see here, grabs you also at the airport. Violence prevention through urban upgrading project in Kailicha, the township of Kailicha, outside of Cape Town. So, again, the capturing, the branding, the worlding of a specific idea of what design or design in Africa might be. And among other projects, I look more deeply into this one in this paper there in Cape Town. And there are design elements in this project. So this is VPUU. It's a project that's been going for at least 15 years there. And it's a project which takes a model from the UN Habitat Program for changing conditions before, and in terms to prevent violence in various ways. And it's a program that also replicates this model in different parts of the world. There's now several VPUUs in South Africa and also in South America. But this is one that's been highly profiled and also highly studied and has developed over quite a long time. And there are architectural elements of VPUU. In fact, it has the model looks like this. It has 3 corners or 3 pillars of the model. Situational aspects of violence is one pillar, and that includes the material, the visual, and other preventative and surveillance and safety measures that can be achieved through architecture, design, lighting, etc. This is one of what's called an active box. It's above, it's visible from far away. They are situated periodically so you can always see one. And between them there are lighted walkways. So they've cleared pathways, they've put lighting, they've made public many of the more informal or private or liminal spaces. And they've created a series of kind of safe spaces, active boxes, lighting, and so on. So there are very clearly architectural, like familiar design aspects of this project, these active boxes. But the model that three-pillar model that they have also includes education and training, specifically in schools for young boys, different notions of violence prevention, different aspects of dialogue and conflict resolution and so on, and a whole other pillar which is about institutional development, including opportunities for employment, but also how do people report, how do they collectivize, how do they try to prevent in a more community organizational, self-governed way their own space, their own place. Again, there's lots of very interesting things about who is behind VP, who funds, the relation to Cape Town, the government itself. It's a very complex project that exists between the city government and the local population. And some of the things that are designed, which are not objects and not architecture, are things like the less material things. They have invented a very specific way a very specific way in which they invite people to the snack. It's the governing committee that decides what to do, that decides how the programs, how the economic incentives, who does the policing, who collects the data on violence. It's a committee that decides how to prioritize what's done in terms of violence prevention in the area. They have a very specific ways of convening that committee to balance across political parties, and also very specific decision-making processes in which the leaders, the designers, the architects take a background role in very specific ways, while at the same time designing the way that this institution or these mechanisms of governance are done. And in the paper, I talk about how that snack is composed or designed, and also the way that the tenancy agreements, which is how people are associated with a house, in this case an informal settlement, which is a very, very politically loaded question in South Africa. So how design has actually taken on the responsibility of the government, not only in policing, but also in permitting people to live in their homes. And they've made some very interesting choices, like including the female in the household on the tenancy certificate, along with the male head of household. They've made some very specific normative decisions and how they do this governing in quite a different way than how it's done in other townships and so on. So the politics are extremely interesting, but also the invisibilities and the blind spots. So there is critiques of this, that the local informal traders do not operate in the same way that this contractual imaginary of the city government and even of the West does. We operate through contracts, we operate through one person signing the contract, and in fact a critique of this from a kind of a black urbanism point of view, or a decolonial point of view might be that this is an imposition in some way of mechanisms such as committees and such of contracts on a community or set of communities which actually operate in other ways, some of which are extremely useful. For example, the women's own stove kells, which is a way of collecting money and saving money for a kind of outside of the banking system. So different ways of governing, different ways of collectivizing, which exist in this place, have not been considered necessarily and are either blind spots or imposed upon in this way. And my argument is that design and architecture have claimed this as an example of the things they do. They're doing governance, they're doing policy, and they are doing this very potentially difficult post-colonial kind of political decisions. And this is the space in which we operate. This is a space that, as Edgar Peterson says, does a kind of radical incrementalism, a new kind of governing from below, a new kind of designing from below, which is a very different kind of practice than visions of the future. So not out there elsewhere, but from below, prefiguring how different mechanisms can be designed that will last for decades, if not longer, in a society such as this. So, to summarize, flux futurity the space in between, how change happens, where it comes from, how to think critically about that. Futures is one way of thinking about difference, the different from the now, the different from an alternative, and the purposes of those futures, not to be reached necessarily or even at all, but to create deliberation, to create critical discussion, to turn us around. A set of practices that are maybe prefiguring a different way of doing design, a different way of thinking of change and transformation. This platforms that I pointed to in the middle are maybe some seeds within design, but there are other places from which design is being done. Governance is being designed, which may look like architecture, may look like design, may even be co-opted by the World Design Capital several years after it has been existing for quite a long time. Now that we call that design, now that we claim that as design, how can we critically relate to the politics of those change processes and those change makers? Well, that's such a neoliberal term. Those change makers within that space, who in fact have been there long before us with different ontologies, cosmologies, and governing practices. So I'm interested in this also more speculatively in terms of what do we want to call as designerly ways of knowing, which knowledges count, which knowledges do we have, and which do we need from the social sciences, from anthropology, from future studies, from feminist theory. This comes to also dialogues that maybe we need to start thinking about in design to deepen, to become more self-critical. Maybe also the relation to other parts of the world, other people, other ontologies, and so on. The voids in our own knowledge and recognizing the limits of our knowledge. And this, I think, is very important in the moment where we are, where many are talking about the design turn. The design turn, where many turn to design. Policymakers turn to design. Cape Town turns to, calls this design. Universities love design at the moment because they see it as a way of translating, for example, basic research or science to more communicative, public-friendly kinds of innovation, practical projects. So the knowledge exchange function of design. The design turn. Universities, as Cameron Tonkinwise talks about, are making a design turn, becoming more applied, becoming more practical, becoming more production-oriented, product-oriented in a specific way, and design is being commissioned to do the same in policy and in many places as well. So Cameron Tonkinwise, many others are talking about the design term, where it is getting a spotlight in a way that I think we need to be very critical about. What knowledges do we bring with us in that? What assumptions of progress, growth, innovation do we have in that? And instead I want to promote that perhaps we also need to turn us around within the design term so that we take that challenge and responsible in a critical and potentially another or other sets of ways than is possible. And I think I leave it there, yes.